It is. I don't know if you noticed, a lot of people are wearing "I love my church" shirts. Mine's kind of hidden under my coat, but a lot of you have them are on. Thank you for wearing those. Let me remind you, if you love your church, invite people to come and be a part to what God is doing in this place. We do love it. When I say I love my church, by the way, I'm saying that means I love you, our church family. And I truly do. You're fantastic, and I'm so appreciative of being a part of this church family. Last week we looked at the life of Jacob. If you remember, we ended where he had that wrestling match with God. He left with two things that happened. Number one, he left with a new name. God changed his name from Jacob to Israel, and he left with a new walk. Remember, he limped the rest of his life because of that encounter with God. And then I kind of left off there, but then he had a surprisingly, we didn't talk about this much, but a surprisingly good reunion with his brother Esau, who he was scared to death to go meet. And then Jacob settled in the land where his father had sojourned. And we pick up in Genesis chapter 37 today in verse 1. Listen to what it says. Now Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned, in the land of Canaan. These are the records of the generations of Jacob. And so we're about to see the generations of Jacob, and then beginning there in chapter 37, all the way to the end of Genesis chapter 50, really for 14 chapters, pretty much the whole thing is about Jacob's son, Joseph. Now, Joseph merits this kind of attention. Joseph was something. I mean, he was really, really something. Regardless of how he was treated, in spite of all the false accusations, the abuse, the malignment, he was abandoned, he was abused, he was forgotten, all of these things, he never was resentful, he never held a grudge. And we'll see next week when we talk about him again next week that he was always very forgiving. So I want us to see what we can learn from the life of Joseph this morning. When I talk about Joseph, when you hear his name, if you think back to when you're a child, if you're not still a child, what is the first thing you remember learning about Joseph in Sunday school? That wasn't rhetorical. I really meant it. What was the first thing you learned about Joseph when you were in Sunday school? What did you learn about him? Yeah, coat. He had a coat of, for crying out loud, even Broadway has a play about it, right? I mean, he had this multicolored coat. That's what I remember about him. So what I thought I'd do this morning, since we know he has this multicolored coat, we'll talk about that in a minute too, but since we know that about him, I want to outline the first part of his life using the coat as our outline guide, okay? So here's the first point of the outline today. This coat, this multicolored coat, was a coat of love. Listen, verse 2. Joseph, when 17 years of age, so Joseph is 17 now, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph. Remember, Israel's Jacob. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a varicolored tunic. So Joseph is 17. He's out pasturing the flocks with these two. Remember that Leah and Rachel, his wives, gave them their handmaids because of jealousy. They wanted to have more kids with their handmaids than the other one. And that's these two wives. So he's out pasturing the flocks with their children. And then it says in verse 3, it tells us Jacob loved Joseph more than all of his sons because he was born to him in his old age. I saw a friend this week on Tuesday I hadn't seen in a long time. He's almost my age, a little bit younger, not much. And he and his wife have an 11-year-old son. He could not stop talking about his 11-year-old son to me, which is really kind of cool. But you know why? Because it's the son of his old age. Same thing with Jacob here. Jacob loved Joseph. He was the son of his old age. But not only that, there were other reasons Jacob felt partial to Joseph. Remember, this was Rachel's son. And Rachel was the love of his life. If you think about, remember last week talking about Jacob. Jacob had 4 wives. By the way, I don't recommend that. So Jacob has 4 wives. Just a glutton for punishment, that's all I'm telling you. So he's got 4 wives, and Rachel's the only one he picked. He saw Rachel, loved her, wanted her, agreed to work for Laban for 7 years for her, and then Laban tricked him, remember, and gave him Leah instead. And then he worked for 7 more years for Rachel, and Scripture says that those 14 years seemed like no time at all to him because he loved Rachel so much. There's a guy that loves a gal right there, girls. And so he loved her. He's the only wife he picked, and this is the son of that wife, and not only that, Joseph was an incredibly special kid on top of that. And on the way home, going back, Rachel gave birth to a second son, Benjamin, and Rachel had died in giving birth. And so here's his son of the wife he loved. And he loved his son for a lot of reasons. Now, the problem is, of all people, Jacob should have known better than to have favorites. Because if you remember the message last week, he came from a dysfunctional family like this, where his father Isaac loved his twin brother Esau, and his mother Rebekah loved him. How'd that work out for that family? Not so good. And he should have known it, but yet he does this nonetheless. Now, this is not the main focus of the passage, but I want to take a minute just to talk about it. The focus of the passage is not Jacob favoring Joseph, but there's things we can learn here. So let me just say something to parents this morning. You have children, and in the first hour I talked about this. This is true for grandparents as well as you deal with your grandchildren. There's just some thoughts for parents not to play favorites. Number one, look for praiseworthy attributes of your children and then celebrate those traits. Your kids are not supposed to be alike. If God's given you multiple kids, you're not supposed to be alike. So look for those traits that you can praise in them and praise them in them. Secondly, demonstrate an unconditional love to them. Demonstrate an unconditional love to your kids and to your grandkids. It's a lot easier, by the way, as a grandparent than it is as a parent. I'll just say that. Be alert to sensitive areas in your child's life. Don't squash them in those sensitive areas. And then strive to be consistent with your kids. Don't treat them differently. Try to be consistent in how you treat your kids. And then clearly lay out some guidelines in your home that you expect from your children. And if they violate those, make sure there are consequences. Excuse me, that there are fair consequences for those. Excuse me, just a second. I knew I should have made 4 wives at home. Just kidding. Okay, when you talk to your kids, this is really important. When you talk to your kids, look them in the eye. Make eye contact. Listen to them. Show them you care. And then finally, let them hear you pray for them. Let your kids hear you pray for them. Let your grandkids hear you pray for them. It'll make a difference. Imagine if Jacob had prayed for his sons individually, where they could have heard him praying for them. You think that would have made a difference in this home? Absolutely, it would have. But instead, Jacob clearly played favorites. Verse 3 says, and he made Joseph a varicolored tunic, or a multicolored tunic. Now, I don't mean to make you sad today, but a lot of scholars, biblical scholars, say that word should not be translated multicolored. It should be translated like long sleeve and long coat or long robe. That it didn't mean so much, it could have been multicolored, but it didn't so much mean that, but it meant that it was a long sleeve, long coat to his ankles, which would be the sign of someone who was not a worker, but who was a manager, who was over other people. So whether it was a beautiful multicolored coat, it works the same, it says the same thing. Either way, his father's saying to his sons, Joseph is more important than you, he is over you, you're the workers, he's the manager. And so when they saw this coat, that's what they saw. Here, let me just break it down this way, that you'll remember it better this way. Okay, this is scripture. Are you ready? Anytime a dad dresses his teenage son, it's a bad idea. So just think of it that way. So he plays favors with his son. It's a coat of love to his father. But to the brothers, it's a coat of hate. Verse 4, his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. He grew up in this home where there was all kind of resentment. They were vengeful. There was all kind of stuff here, and their jealousy turned to resentment, and their resentment turned to hatred. And this line in scripture here means they could not speak a single kind word to Joseph. Not one. They couldn't look at their brother and say a single kind word to him. Now try to imagine a home with 12 brothers, and there's one that they can't speak a single kind word to. You can imagine this is something just waiting to explode. And that is indeed what happens. And on top of that, Joseph was a dreamer. He had 2 dreams, remember? He had the dream first. He says, we're out in the field. He tells his brothers, oh yeah, we're out in the field, and we're bringing these sheaves together, and my sheaf stands up, and your sheaves all come around and bow to my sheaf. That's the dream he had. And his brothers said, so let me see if I got this right. We're going to all bow to you, is that right? And it says, they hated him for his dreams and for his words. And then he says to them sometime later, hey, I've had another dream. This time, the sun and the moon and 11 stars all bowed down to me. And he tells that one to his father and to his brothers. And his father said, really, son, are your mother and I going to bow to you? And are your brothers going to bow to you? And the brothers, it says, hated him for it. They were jealous of him and hated him. But it says Jacob thought about this and pondered it and thought on what Joseph has said. Now, the reality is a lot of commentators say because Joseph told these dreams to his brothers, and they think, well, why did he do that? He didn't have to do it. And so they draw the conclusion that Joseph is a spoiled brat, that he's this favored son, and he's spoiled, and he's just a brat. And a lot of them believe that. I don't think that. By the way, Scripture doesn't say that. They just read that in, and it's a fair read in. I mean, I can see how you build the case. I don't think that's what Scripture's saying. I believe, and this is just my opinion, okay? I always try to tell you if something's my opinion. This is my opinion. I think Joseph is just so pure-hearted that when he hears the truth, he's just going to say it. I think that's just who he was. And if you look at the rest of his life, it kind of bears that out. And it says in the one passage I read you says that he came back and gave a bad report to his father about his brothers. And some of the commentators take that and say that they take one of the words and say the only time that word's ever used is for a false report. And so they think he's given this false report to his father. I don't see that when I read the Scripture, look at the meaning of the word. I don't see that there. I think he simply just is telling the truth of what he saw that day when he went out and saw his brothers and what they were doing. And so he just simply tells the truth. Here's the reality, though. What the reality of the verses and what we need to know is his brothers hated him. They absolutely hated him and all that he stood for. And so his dad sends him one day, his dad sends him out on a journey to go out and check on his brothers. They've gone up to Shechem with all of the sheep, and he sends Joseph up, which is a number of miles, and he says, I want you to go up and check on the welfare of your brother and of the sheep. And he's obedient, and he goes and he does this. And I want you to think about this one. There's one passage here I want you to think about. I'm not going to talk about it today, but kind of put it aside for next week. It says, a man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field, and the man asked him, what are you looking for? He said, I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they're pasturing the flock. Now get this. It says, the man said, they have moved from here, for I heard them say, let us go up to Dothan. So Joseph went up and found them. Now think about this. Here's Joseph a number of miles from home in Shechem looking for his sheep. And he just happens to bump into a man that just happened to overhear his brothers talking that they were going to go up to Dothan. And just lock that away because we're going to see how little things make a big difference in the life of Joseph next week. So Joseph obediently does what his dad asked, and he goes up and he finds his brothers. But when you think about his situation, it's really interesting. It's really interesting. Tragically, his brothers never go to his father and talk to his father about the real issue, because their real issue isn't with Joseph. They do hate Joseph, but the real issue is with the dad. And Jacob's favoritism, not just of Joseph, but of Rachel, his wife, over their mom and what's gone on in their life. And there's a real tragedy there. And the idea here is when there's trouble in a marriage, very often there's trouble in the home, in the life of the children as well. Now, I say that to make this point. Jonathan talked about the marriage conference coming up, the Cherish Conference, the last weekend of this month. I want to highly encourage you to go. Gary will not deal with issues like this one where a guy has 4 wives at home. He won't be talking about that, but he will give you a lot of really good, valuable stuff on marriage, give us a lot of good, valuable stuff on marriage. So I encourage you to go and be a part, because when the marriage suffers, the whole family suffers. Now, the scene shifts now. Joseph is heading to his brothers. He's almost there, and the brothers see him coming, and now the dialogue goes to the brothers. Now the brothers are talking. Now listen to what the brothers say. When they saw him from a distance, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. Do you think they hated him? They see him coming, and they're plotting to put him to death. They said to one another, here comes the dreamer. Now then, come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we will say a wild beast devoured him. Then let us see what will become of his dreams. But Reuben, the oldest, says, hey, he doesn't like that. Why don't we just throw him in the pit instead and not shed any blood? And Reuben's idea was, if I can get him to throw him in the pit, I'll come back later and I'll rescue him. He's trying to protect his little brother to some degree. Then verse 23 says, so it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic. So they take the robe off of him, the coat off of him, the vari-colored tunic that was on him. And they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty without any water in it. So this is like a pit that would have held water. There's no water in it. And then verse 25, then they sat down to eat a meal. now catch this. Between verse 24 and 25, something's missing. They took him and threw him in a pit. The pit was empty, no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. Now what's missing? What's missing there is Joseph crying out for his brothers to knock it off and to save him and not put him through this, not to kill him, not to treat him like this. And it's not in this passage, but it is in Scripture. Because about 22 years later, and you see it in Genesis chapter 42, verse 21, the brothers are in a tight spot, and they're thinking back to 22 years earlier, and this is what they say about that moment. It says, "Truly we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen." So Joseph is pleading to his brothers from this pit. And then his brothers, these hard-hearted brothers, they sat down to enjoy a meal. They throw him in a pit, and they sat down and have lunch together as brothers. Listen, it's very possible that a whole lot of people in this room today are in a pit. You find yourself in a pit through no fault of your own. You've been mistreated. You've been abused. You've been forgotten. I want you to listen to what James Montgomery Boyce says. He is a great pastor from the past. Listen to what James Montgomery Boyce says about this moment in the pit. He says this to all of us. He says, "I find this profoundly moving and rich in comfort for those who, like Joseph, may have suffered much injustice and indifference. Have you experienced human cruelty? Does no one seem to care that you're suffering? Are others indifferent to the damage being done to you? Do they even trample on the bruises? If so, you can identify with Joseph as he cried out from the pit to his brothers. I hope that you will also be able to identify with him as he learned through this and other times of suffering to commit his ways to God, who hears the cries of his afflicted people and always moves to rescue and restore them in due time." Is this true for you today? You bet it is. You bet it is. If you will cry out to God from whatever pit you're in, you can know as his child that he hears and that he will rescue you and he will restore you in his timing. Brothers look up and they see a caravan coming, and the caravan's headed south to Egypt. And Judah says, "Hey, you know what? What profit is there in killing him? Let's make some money off our brother. Let's sell him to the caravan." And they do. They bring their brother out of the pit, and they sell him for 20 shekels of silver. And Scripture says, and they took Joseph to Egypt. The coat is a coat of love for the father Jacob. It's a coat of hate for the brothers. And now it becomes a coat of deceit to deceive Jacob to what the brothers had done. Reuben comes back, and Joseph isn't in the pit. He freaks out. What am I going to do now? I'm responsible. My brother's gone. And he's like going crazy. And then verse 31 says, "So they, the brothers, took Joseph's tunic and slaughtered a male goat and dipped the tunic in the blood. And they sent the varicolored tunic and brought it to their father and said, 'We found this. Please examine it to see whether it's your son's tunic or not.'" How cold are these brothers? I mean, obviously they know it's their brother's tunic. They take it, they dip blood in it, or dip it in blood. And they say to their dad, "Hey, Dad, is this Joseph's? You're the one that can recognize it. You gave it to him." Deceiving their father with the worst kind of deceit. He examines it. He says, "It's my son. Certainly a wild beast has devoured him." Verse 34, "So Jacob tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days." And then the Scripture says that all the family, all the daughters, all the sons, all these deceitful sons came to him and tried to comfort him in his mourning, and he would not be comforted. But here's the reality. The deceiver, the schemer, Jacob, was deceived in the worst kind of way by his own sons. The worst kind of deceit, making him think his son was dead. Verse 36, it's almost like a Western. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. One more thing from the life of Joseph today before I want to wrap up. His story is so amazing. There's so many facets to it. So Joseph is sold as a slave in Egypt to a man named Potiphar. The story unfolds now in chapter 39. And in chapter 39, we have no indication. Scripture doesn't tell us how long Joseph's been there now. Meanwhile, boom, and you go there, and he's there. We don't know if he's been in Potiphar's house for 3 months or 3 years. We don't know what kind of adjustment period and what kind of adjustments he's had to make to get to this point. It just picks up right there. But here's what we know that's happened, right? Joseph is raised as a favored son of Jacob. He's treated great. One day he goes out to his brothers. They strip him of his coat. They throw him in the pit. They're going to kill him. Instead, they sell him to this caravan. He's taken by this caravan as a slave down to Egypt. He's put on the slave block in Egypt. He's sold as a slave to this guy Potiphar, who is the captain of the guard. We'll talk about that in a minute. And now he's in Potiphar's house in a culture he didn't know and in a language he does not know. You see the picture? That's what he's gone through. And now as a slave in a new country, Joseph has a coat of a different color. Now he's wearing the coat of a slave. He's not wearing this coat of the favored son anymore. This Potiphar is the quote, the captain of the bodyguard. That means he is, one historian says, it means he's the chief of the executioners. He's not a guy you mess with. He's the guy with the power of life and death. But yet Scripture says Joseph not only adjusted to the situation, that he adjusted really, really well and flourished in the situation. Now, the reason that emerges in Scripture that Joseph flourished so well and did so well, and it comes up a number of times in his life, so kind of lock this one into your head. It'll be important next week, is this. Verse 39, or chapter 39, verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man. And God so blessed Joseph in Potiphar's house. Listen, so now here he is in this chief executioner's house. We don't know how long he's been there, but we just know that God has so blessed him, and he so won over this Potiphar in his house that it says, so Potiphar left everything he owned in Joseph's charge. In other words, Joseph was running his whole household, everything about it. And with him, there he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. In other words, Joseph was doing such a great job, all Potiphar had to worry about was what he's going to eat. He just sit down and eat. Joseph, you got everything else. I was thinking about this. I want a guy like this in my house. I would add something to that verse. It would say, and Craig concerned himself with nothing but what he ate, and he played golf. That'd be it. I would eat and play golf. I'd eat, and Joseph, how's it going? Good. I'm going back. You know, that's the idea here. Potiphar said, Joseph, you got it. That's how well Joseph had done and how much God had blessed him. But now don't miss this phrase, though. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. He was a good-looking guy. Yeah. And he was put together. Remind you of anybody? No. That hurt. Joseph's got it all. He is a good-looking dude, and he's solid. And Mrs. Potiphar, took notice, and she starts coming unto him. And my guess is, Scripture doesn't say this, but you could probably fairly guess and say probably subtly in the beginning, just saying little things to Joseph. Hey, Joseph. And Joseph, I believe, was so pure and so naive, he didn't even get it. Finally, she stops that, and she finally just says basically, hey, Joseph, come to bed with me. That's pretty direct. And she didn't do it just once. She did it day after day after day after day after day. Here's the principle here. With great success often comes great trust. And with great trust comes great vulnerability. And so when God's put you in a position where you begin to move up in the world and things are going well and you're climbing the ladder of success. By the way, temptation can come at us at any time in life when we're going up or when we're going down. But it seems that when we're going up, it comes in such a subtle way. And we start to think we're bulletproof. Look at me. I'm something. And it's so easy to be deceived in the subtlety and just miss it. And bam, we're in trouble. But listen to how Joseph handles it. Verse 8, really simple, but he refused. Verse 9, he says, there's no one greater in this house than I, and he, Potiphar, has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God? he refused. Joseph just refused. He said no. Pretty simple. Nothing supernatural about it. I mean, Joseph's a godly dude. He's amazing. But I've almost said several times he's a red-blooded American. No, he's a red-blooded Hebrew. But he's human. But he just refused. He said no. He was determined not to yield. Now, Scripture gives us a couple of reasons. One, he says that he's loyal to his master. The second one says, even more importantly, you see his loyalty to God. He says, how could I do this great evil and sin against God? How could he do that? How could Joseph refuse this 20-something-year-old kid on top of the world? No one's going to know. But the reality is, Joseph understood that his life was an open book before the living God. Joseph understood that. And he lived like it. And God had become so real to him. He lived in the reality of God's presence in his life. Now, he came to the point this one day where words weren't enough anymore for Potiphar's wife. It says she caught him by his garment saying, lie with me. So she grabs him. And she says, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled. She's alone in the house. Probably, we don't know, but there's a good chance she's orchestrated it, made sure everybody else was out of the house, every other worker's out of the house. And she physically grabbed him and holds on so tightly that when he jerks away and runs away, he leaves his outer garment, that coat he would have been wearing, there. What a practical picture of how we all should handle a moment like this in our lives. When temptation like this comes, when sensual, sexual temptation comes. You don't reason with it. You don't think about it. You don't quote scriptures at it. You run. Pretty simple. That's godly advice. It's in 2 Timothy, by the way, also. Joseph just gives us a picture of it. You just run, you get out of Dodge. That's exactly what Joseph was supposed to do. It's exactly what we're supposed to do. And it's what he did. And in this temptation, he did not sin against God. He did not give in. But Mrs. P's lust turned to hate because he's refused her. And now she accuses him of having attempted to rape her. And Mr. P doesn't like it at all. And the next scene, Joseph is thrown in prison for no fault of his own. And now Joseph is in prison, and that's where we'll pick the story up next week. Now let me just make a couple of points to the story before we close. First one is this. What do we learn from him in this temptation moment? When sensual temptation comes your way, when sexual temptation comes, and in our culture, folks, it's going to come your way. Refuse it. What did Joseph do? But he refused. Refuse it. And by the way, he didn't just refuse it once. You refuse it one time and you think, oh, I've got this thing knocked out, I'm okay. No. It came at him day after day after day, and he refused it, and he refused it, and he refused it. You make up your mind beforehand. You resolve beforehand that you're going to refuse it. And you refuse it. And then you get out of Dodge and you run. Through the course of being in ministry for a lot of years now, I've had to go and confront men on a number of occasions. Men that I knew in a lot of cases, that I knew well. And I was thinking about it this week. In almost every case, if those guys, when the temptation come, would have simply done what Joseph did and left, run, gotten out of Dodge, it would have saved a world of heartache and hurt and brokenness simply by running. Just refuse it. Run. If you're in a position at work, in an office, somewhere else, get out of Dodge. Don't give yourself that opportunity. Here's the second thing. My prayer is that all of us will be able to, like Joseph, handle the pits of life, ultimately like Joseph did. That we'll have the same kind of attitude. That when rejection comes, when heartache comes, when abuse comes, when you're treated in a way that you never deserve to be treated, and your life ends up in a pit, just know that God hears the cries of his afflicted children. And he will hear, and he will rescue you, and he will restore you in his time. We see a lot about timing in Joseph's life, and things don't happen overnight. But God does move, and God does work. As our story closes today, where we'll pick up next week, Joseph's in prison. He's in prison, but listen to what later in that same chapter 39, it says again, that same idea again of Joseph. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. And now God is with Joseph in prison. Do you know the difference between Jacob and Joseph? The difference between Jacob and Joseph, God was with Jacob, but Jacob didn't live like God was with him. God was with Joseph, and Joseph lived like God was with him. That's the difference. And that's what God calls you and me to do, is to live like he's with us. I want to close with this comment. Gary Thomas, who's coming to do our marriage conference, I read this, something he said this week, and it sums up these passages because we've talked about family and all these things. Here's what Gary says. Life isn't about coming from the perfect family. Life isn't about having the perfect parents. None of us do we? Life isn't about finding the perfect spouse. Life isn't about finding the perfect job. Life is about walking with the perfect God. Wherever you are, whatever your family, whatever your job, whatever anything, what your life is ultimately about is walking with the perfect God who loves you and gave himself for you.